I have run Founders Day in Harlow Bay for 19 years, and in all that time I never once believed a lunch lady could hold her breath for 2 minutes with a drowning man's belt in her fist. That is the honest place to start. Not with the woman. With me, and with what I thought I knew, because I am the one who was wrong, and a man ought to say so plainly before he tells you how it happened. I spent 22 years in the Navy before I ever set foot behind a folding table at that pavilion. Bosun's mate, surface fleet, the kind of sailor who knows the weight of a mooring line in his palms, and the smell of the deck after a cold rain, and not much that glitters beyond that. When I retired, I came home to Harlow Bay, because my father had painted lobster buoys here and his father before him, and because a man wants to end up somewhere the water sounds the way it did when he was a boy. The town made me the Founders Day coordinator the way small towns hand a job to whoever won't drop it, and I ran it the way I ran a deck, early, loud, and sure of myself. Harlow Bay is a Navy town without quite being a Navy town. We sit an hour up the coast from the base, close enough that half our fathers wore the uniform, and far enough that the uniform became a story people told rather than a thing they still carried. We are proud of it the way you are proud of a photograph. On Founders Day, we string the pavilion with flags, and the schoolchildren stand up in the morning and tell the crowd what their families do, and everyone claps, and then we spend the afternoon eating fried clams and pretending the channel isn't cold enough to stop a heart in 4 minutes even in June. That cold is the second thing you should know, because the water in that channel does not care what month it is. The Harlow runs deep and narrow between the town landing and the rocks off Scully's Point, and when the tide turns to ebb, it pulls out toward the open like something with a grudge. Old men in this town teach their grandchildren one rule before they teach them anything else. You do not swim the channel on a falling tide. I have pulled 2 bodies out of that water in my life. Both times the tide was ebbing. Both times I was too late, and both times I told myself there had been nothing anyone could have done, because that is the lie you need to keep working the shoreline. So that is your narrator, a proud old sailor, sure of the water, sure of himself, running his 19th Founders Day and half listening to a line of nervous 8-year-olds tell the crowd what their parents did for a living. Cass Bishop's girl was near the end of the line. I knew Cass a little, the way you know everyone in a town this size without knowing them at all. She worked the lunch counter at the elementary school. She was a compact, quiet woman, maybe 40, with cropped brown hair going gray at the temples and forearms that were harder than a lunch lady's forearms had any right to be, though I never once thought about that until later, when everything I'd failed to notice came back to me at once. She wore long sleeves even in warm weather. She said good morning if you said it first and not much otherwise. She had moved to Harlow Bay 3 or 4 years back, rented the gray salt box out past the boatyard, and folded herself into the town so quietly that most people couldn't have told you her name, only that the kids liked her, which in an elementary school is worth more than a resume. Her daughter was named June, though everyone called her Junie, and Junie Bishop was the opposite of quiet. She was 8 and gap-toothed and built like a question mark, all elbows and enthusiasm, and she had been vibrating in that line for an hour waiting for her turn. I remember thinking, watching her bounce on her toes, that whatever she was about to say, she plainly believed it with her whole heart. The showcase is a gentle thing, mostly. A boy said his father drove the propane truck and everyone clapped. A girl said her mother was a nurse at the county hospital and everyone clapped. A pair of twins said their dad ran the hardware store on Main and half the crowd whooped because half the crowd owed him money. It is a small, warm ritual, and I have always loved it, the way children stand up and hand you their parents like gifts. Then June Bishop climbed up on the milk crate we kept behind the microphone for the little ones, and she leaned into the mic so close it popped, and she said, in a voice that carried clean out over the water, "My mom's a Navy SEAL." I want to be fair to the crowd because I was part of it, and what happened next was not cruelty. It started as delight. It is a wonderful thing for a child to say, and the first ripple through the folding chairs was the warm kind, the awe that a room makes when a little girl says something big about someone she loves. If it had stopped there, this would be a different story, or no story at all. But it did not stop there, because Roy Tancredi was in the third row. Roy runs the charter boats off the town landing, 2 diesel tubs he takes tourists out on to look at seals and not catch fish, and Roy has spent 40 years cultivating the idea that he is the final authority on anything that happens on or near the water in Harlow Bay. He is a big man with a big laugh and a way of making his opinions sound like weather, like a thing that was simply going to happen to you whether you wanted it or not. And Roy Tancredi laughed. Not the warm laugh. The other one. "A seal," he said, loud enough to turn heads, twisting around in his chair to play to the rows behind him. "Sweetheart, your mom slings tater tots at the grade school." He said it grinning like he was letting the kid in on a joke, and a few people laughed with him because Roy's laugh has always been contagious and because it was, God help us, a little bit funny. "I've been on this water 40 years. I'd know a seal if one walked up my dock, and I'm looking at the lunch line. I'll continue exactly where I left off." Junie's face didn't fall right away. That's the part I've never been able to shake. She was still smiling when Roy said it, because she was 8 and she didn't yet understand that a grown man had just decided to be right at her expense in front of 200 people. She looked out at the laughing rows the way you look at a crowd you think is laughing with you. And then she found her mother's face, somewhere back near the clam shack, and I watched the child read something in that face, some small stillness, and understand, slowly, that she had said a thing the adults had decided was not true. The smile went, not into tears, into something worse in a kid, a kind of careful flatness, the face a child makes when she's decided not to let you see it land. "She is," June said into the microphone, quieter now. "She really is." Okay, Roy said, waving a big hand, magnanimous in his victory. "She's a SEAL, sure she is, and I'm the Secretary of the Navy." That got the real laugh, the whole pavilion laugh, and I confess to you now plainly that I laughed too, not hard. But I laughed because I was standing at the edge of the stage thinking the same thing Roy was saying out loud, and it is a coward's comfort to laugh at a thing you already believed in silence. I stepped to the mic and I moved it along, the way you do, kind and brisk. "All right, big hand for Junie," I said, and the crowd clapped, and it was the clap you give to paper over a thing, and June climbed down off the milk crate and walked back through the folding chairs with her chin level and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she did not cry, and that was almost the hardest part to watch. I looked for the mother then. I'll admit I was curious about the woman's face, whether she'd be angry, whether she'd come storming up to defend the kid, whether she'd shrink. Cass Bishop did none of those things. She stood by the clam shack in her long sleeves with a paper tray in her hands, and she watched her daughter cross the whole length of that pavilion, and her face did not move. It was not the frozen face of a woman humiliated. I have seen that face. It flinches even when it's trying not to. This was something else. It was flat and still the way deep water is flat and still, and I remember a small, uncomfortable thought crossing my mind and then leaving before I could hold it. That is not the stillness of a woman who has nothing. That is the stillness of a woman who has decided, a long time ago, that she does not need you to believe her. When Junie reached her, Cass crouched down to the girl's level, said something low I couldn't hear, and tucked a strand of hair behind the kid's ear. Junie nodded. Cass stood, took the girl's hand, and turned back to the clam shack to keep working the line, because she was on the volunteer roster to serve food and there was food to serve. She did not look at Roy Tancredi. She did not look at me. She just went back to work, and I thought, that's a proud one. And then I thought about the fried clams that were going cold under the heat lamps, and I forgot about the whole thing for exactly 2 hours and 11 minutes. I have gone back over those 2 hours many times. What I was doing while a decorated combat swimmer served fried clams to the people who just laughed at her daughter. I was checking the sound system. I was arguing with the ice delivery. I was proud of my festival and sure of my water, and I did not think about Cass Bishop at all. and I would give a great deal to have those 2 hours back. Not because I could have changed anything, but because I would like to have spent even 1 minute of them looking at that woman, with the respect she had already earned in some other life I knew nothing about. The seeds were all there. I see them now the way you see a channel marker once someone points at it, obvious, and how did you ever miss it? The forearms, the long sleeves in June, the way she'd carried the heavy propane tanks for the friars 2 at a time, one in each hand without seeming to notice their weight, and how I'd registered it for half a second and filed it under nothing. The way she stood, I know now what that is. The loose, weight-forward set of a body that has been trained to move fast from stillness. And I had a career in the Navy, and I looked right past it because she was wearing a hairnet. That is the thing about contempt. It doesn't just make you unkind. It makes you blind. Roy Tancredi looked at Cass Bishop and saw a lunch lady, and so did I, and so did every soul in that pavilion, and the woman we were all failing to see had, at that moment, more cold water hours than every man on that waterfront put together. The afternoon went the way Founder's Day always goes. The tide, which I had checked that morning the way I check it every morning of my life, turned to ebb at 3:14. The centerpiece of the afternoon, every year, is the harbor parade. It is not much of a parade. The local boats, the charters, the lobster boats, a few pleasure craft with bunting tied to their rails make a slow loop out past the town landing, around the can buoy off Scully's Point, and back, while the crowd waves from the pavilion and someone plays a scratchy recording of Anchors Away over the loudspeakers. It is sweet and a little silly, and in 19 years nothing had ever gone wrong with it, which is exactly the kind of record that makes a man careless. The trouble that year had a name, and the name was the Marigold. The Marigold was a 40-foot excursion boat that a fellow named Denny Pruitt had bought at auction the winter before and fixed up just enough to be dangerous. Denny was not a bad man, only an optimistic one, and he had got the idea that Founder's Day was his chance to run harbor tour for cash. He'd sold tickets all morning off a hand-lettered sign, and by the time the parade formed up, he had crammed something like 31 people onto a boat that had no business carrying 20. Families. Grandparents. A church group up from the county in matching yellow shirts. Kids. He'd taken their money and packed them rail to rail on the open upper deck because that's where the view was, and the view is what they'd paid for, and the whole top-heavy mess of it swung out into the parade line riding low and stiff, and I watched it go by from the pavilion and thought, that boat is riding funny, and did nothing, because it was Denny's boat and Denny had a license and I was busy being the coordinator. Roy Tancredi's charter was 2 boats ahead of the Marigold in the line. I mentioned that because of what it meant later, that the one man on that water who fancied himself its master had his back to the disaster, and his engines running away from it when it came. The parade made its slow way out, the crowd waved, the scratchy music played. And at the turn, right at the can buoy off Scully's Point, where the channel narrows and the ebb tide that had been building since 3:14 comes ripping through the gap like water out of a hose. The Marigold went to make her turn, and the current caught her, and 31 people all leaned the same way at the same moment to see the seal somebody had shouted about, and the boat that was already riding too high and too heavy simply kept going over. I have tried many times to describe how fast it was. People imagine a capsizing as a slow, groaning thing, a boat laying gently onto its side. It was not that. It was a lurch and then a total commitment, the whole top-heavy hull rolling past the point of no return between one wave and the next, and the sound, I will hear the sound until I die, the sound of 31 people screaming and hitting cold water all at once. And then, much worse, the sound stopping, because water does that, it takes the screaming and puts a lid on it. The Marigold went fully over and floated there upside down in the middle of the channel, her white hull to the sky, her keel dripping, and around her the water boiled with people. And under her, I knew it in my gut before my mind would say it, under her, in the air pocket and the tangle of seats and rails, were the ones who hadn't gotten clear. And the tide was ebbing, pulling all of it, boat and bodies and screaming and silence, out toward the open sea. But here is what I want you to understand about the next 90 seconds, because it is the hinge of everything. And I need you to feel how helpless we were so that what she did will land on you the way it landed on me. The professionals were 20 minutes out. That is the truth of a small town on the water. The Coast Guard station is up the coast. The county rescue boat launches from the far side of the harbor and has to come around the point. The fire department has a Zodiac, but the fire department was at the pavilion eating clams like everyone else. And by the time two of them sprinted for the truck and the truck reached the ramp and the Zodiac hit the water, 4 minutes had gone, and 4 minutes in that cold channel is most of a life. On the water in that moment there were boats, Roy's charter, the lobster boats, Denny himself flung clear and thrashing, and not one of them could do the thing that needed doing. You cannot bring a 40-foot lobster boat in among drowning swimmers without killing them with your own hull and prop. Roy came about, I'll give him that. He came about hard and fast, but he came about into a debris field of human beings and had to cut his engines and sit there 50 yards off, screaming into his radio, because the one thing his 40 years on the water had not given him was any way to get the trapped people out from under that hull. The people on the surface, the ones who could swim, were being pulled away from the wreck by the ebb, and the people under the hull were breathing whatever air was left in that shrinking pocket, and every soul on that waterfront stood at the rail of the pavilion and screamed and could do nothing. I was one of them. I want that on the record. I am a retired bosun's mate with 22 years and 2 drowned men already on my conscience, and I stood at that rail with my hands on the wood, and I did not move, because I was 61 years old and the water was a quarter mile out, and I knew, with the terrible clarity of a man who knows the water, that anyone who went in after them was going to be the next body I failed to pull out. That is the moment Cass Bishop set down her paper tray. I didn't see her start. Nobody did. What I saw was a commotion at the end of the town landing, down where the floats are, and a shape going off the end of the last float in a flat racing dive that didn't so much enter the water as disappear into it. And someone next to me said, "Who is that?" And someone else said, "Is that the lunch lady?" And I was already moving down the pavilion steps toward the landing because some old instinct in me had woken up and was screaming that whoever had just gone in had gone in wrong, too far out, too cold on the ebb, and was about to become the thing I'd spent my life failing to prevent. I was wrong about that too. I was wrong about everything that afternoon, and this was the last and largest thing I was wrong about, and I have never in my life been so grateful to be a fool. She did not swim to the wreck the way a person swims. I have watched a lot of people move through water in my life, strong swimmers among them, and what I saw from the end of that landing did not look like any of them. She was low and flat and almost entirely under, surfacing only to sip air on a rhythm so even it looked mechanical, and she was not fighting the ebb. That was the thing that struck the old sailor in me even in my panic. She was not fighting the tide. She was reading it, sliding across it at an angle that let the current carry her toward the wreck instead of away, spending the water's strength instead of her own. I have since learned there is a name for what she was doing and schools where they teach it, and years of a life it takes to make it look that easy. In the moment all I knew was that a woman I had watched serve fried clams was crossing a quarter mile of killing water faster than I would have believed possible and getting stronger as she went. And I stood there with my mouth open and my old heart hammering, and I understood, all at once and far too late, that the child had been telling the truth. She reached the first cluster of swimmers, the church group in their yellow shirts, 3 of them clinging to a floating cooler and one of them not clinging to anything, an old man going under. She did not grab the old man the way panic grabs. She came up behind him, and I saw her hand go flat between his shoulder blades, and she said something to him. You could see her mouth move, close to his ear, calm. And the man who had been drowning stopped fighting, because that is what training does. It puts calm into another body through your hands and your voice. And she rolled him onto his back and had him moving toward Roy's charter in a cross-chest carry before I'd finished registering that she'd reached him at all. She did not take him all the way. That was the second thing that told me what she was. An amateur saves the person in front of them and calls it a day. Cass Bishop towed that old man exactly far enough to hand him off. She got him to the lip of the debris field where the lobstermen had finally figured out they could pull people over the low stern of a skiff, and she put his hand on the skiff's rail and she left him, because he was going to live now and there were people who weren't, and she turned back toward the hull, toward the upside-down boat, toward the ones underneath. That is where the professionals would have hesitated, and she didn't. Everyone on that water understood by then that the surface swimmers, however frightened, were mostly going to be all right. They could breathe. They could float. Help was coming. The dying was happening under the hull, in the dark, in the air pocket that was getting smaller and fouler with every breath the trapped people took. And the only way to reach them was to leave the sunlight and the surface and go down and in, under a 40-foot boat, on an ebbing tide, into a space full of tangled seats and dangling straps and panicking people who would drown you as fast as save themselves. No man on that waterfront was going to do it. I would not have done it. I am telling you the plain truth. I would not have done it, and I had spent my life on the water. She jackknifed and went under the hull and was gone. The waiting was the worst of it. She'd gone under and the white hull sat there dripping and the crowd on the pavilion had gone silent. You could hear the water now, and the gulls, and Denny Prout sobbing somewhere off to the side. And I stood at the end of the landing counting in my head the way you count when someone you love is under too long, and I got to 40, and to 60, and to 90, and there was nothing, just the hull and the tide and the cold, and I thought, there it is, that's 3. I'm going to pull a third one out of this channel, and this one saved 4 people first. At 110 seconds the hull boiled and a head broke the surface. Not hers, a boy's, maybe 12, gasping and shrieking and alive, and then her arm hooked across his chest from behind. And she brought him up through God knows what tangle in the dark, and she surfaced with him and took one breath, and passed him toward the nearest lobster skiff and went straight back down. No rest. One breath. Down. She did that 5 times. I counted every one. 5 times she went under that hull into the dark, and 5 times she came back with a living person, the boy, then a heavy-set woman she had to fight the current to move, then 2 more of the church group, then last of all a small girl who wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. And this is the one I will tell you about, because this is the one where I finally understood the difference between what Cass Bishop was and what the rest of us were. She surfaced with that limp child, and she did not waste a second getting her to a boat. She flipped onto her own back, put the girl on her chest, and treading that ebbing channel with her legs alone, keeping both their faces clear of the chop by main strength. She started rescue breaths right there in the open water, in the current, holding her own body as the platform because there was no platform, no time, no deck. And I watched a woman in a soaked lunch volunteer apron do in the middle of a running tide the thing they train you for on a dry mat in a warm room and pray you never have to do for real. 2 breaths, a pause, reading the child, 2 more, and the little girl convulsed and vomited seawater and began thinly to cry, and the sound of that child crying came across the water to the silent pavilion, and I heard behind me 200 people begin to weep at once. By then the fire Zodiac had finally reached the wreck, and the county boat was coming around the point, and there were hands to take the children and the church group and the heavy-set woman, and the rescue that had been impossible 90 seconds ago was suddenly, because of one person, merely difficult. She handed the last child up into the Zodiac, and a fireman reached down to haul her in too, and she shook her head, I saw it. She shook her head and went back under the hull one final time to be sure, because that is what you do, you clear the space. You do not leave until you have checked the dark yourself. And when she came up empty and let them pull her into the boat at last, she had been in that channel for 11 minutes and had brought out 9 people. 5 of them from under a capsized hull on an ebbing tide, and had lost not one. They brought her into the town landing because that's where the ramp was. And by the time the Zodiac nosed up to the float, half the town had come down off the pavilion and was crowding the landing in a silence I had never heard in 19 years of that festival. Cass Bishop climbed out of the boat under her own power, waved off the blanket somebody tried to put on her, and stood on the float dripping and steaming faintly in the afternoon air, looking not triumphant, not spent, only alert, her eyes already moving over the crowd counting heads, checking the children being wrapped in blankets, doing the math of who was accounted for. A rescuer's math. She wasn't done working even standing still. And into that silence came a man I hadn't noticed all day. He was standing near the front of the crowd in civilian clothes, khakis, a windbreaker, nothing that marked him, a lean, weathered man of about 50 who had, I would learn, driven up that morning from the base to watch his nephew in the children's showcase and eat fried clams like anybody's uncle. His name was Commander Aaron Voss, and he was, on the day the Marigold went over, a serving officer in the United States Navy with more time around water like that channel than any man on the landing. He had watched the whole rescue from the pavilion rail. He had watched it, I found out later, with the specific and growing recognition of a professional watching another professional do work. He understood down to the bone, because he'd known, from the second flat racing dive off the float, that whatever he was watching was not an amateur, and he'd spent 11 minutes trying to place where a woman in this town could have learned to move like that. He stepped out of the crowd and onto the float, and he looked at her face, and something crossed his own, a flicker, then a certainty. And he said one word quietly, but the landing had gone so silent that it carried. Undertow. She went still. Everyone was still, but she went still in a different way, the way a person goes still when a name they'd put down years ago is picked back up. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "It's been a while, sir." "Bishop," Voss said, and his voice was not steady. "Chief Bishop." He said it to her, but he was half turning to the crowd as he said it, the way a man does when he needs witnesses to a thing he can't quite believe he's saying. "I had your file in front of me for a boarding op in the Gulf. I never met you. They didn't let us meet the swimmers who did the water work." He shook his head slowly. "The cold water rescue off the Kamchatka shelf. 19 men off a burning trawler in water that kills you in 90 seconds. That was you. Undertow was you." "That was a team, sir," Cass said, "not me." "It was a team," Voss agreed. And now he did turn fully to the crowd, and his voice found itself and hardened into the thing a Navy man's voice becomes when he has decided a thing must be understood. And this woman ran it, combat swimmer, special warfare, retired chief petty officer. He let that sit on the silent landing for a second. There are men wearing every ribbon the Navy makes who could not have done what I just watched her do in that channel. I want this town to hear me say that. I have served 26 years, and I have never seen a finer piece of water work in my life. And then Commander Aaron Voss, in his windbreaker and his khakis, on a floating dock in a nothing town on Founder's Day, came to attention and rendered her a hand salute, slow and full and correct, and held it. I have thought a great deal about what a salute is. It is not applause. Applause is a crowd deciding it is pleased with you. A salute is one professional telling another that the debt of respect is owed and will be paid whether or not anyone is watching. It is the oldest hard currency the service has, and it cannot be faked, and it cannot be bought, and the man rendering it was giving her the only thing he had that was worth anything. And everyone on that landing understood it, even the ones who'd never worn the uniform, because some things are legible without translation. Cass Bishop straightened. You could see the old training take her spine, and she returned it, chief to commander. And the whole crowd, 200 people who 3 hours earlier had laughed a little girl off a milk crate, came apart. Not into cheering. Into the other thing. Men my age with their hats in their hands. The church group in their soaked yellow shirts on their knees on the ramp. My own eyes, I will tell you, running like a boy's. I looked for Roy Tancredi. He was at the back of the crowd where he'd tied up his charter, and he had heard every word. And Roy Tancredi, 40 years the self-appointed master of that water, the man who'd said I'd know a seal if one walked up my dock, was standing with both hands flat on the piling in front of him like a man who needed something to hold, and his face had nothing in it but shame. He did not bluster. He did not make it about himself. Whatever else Roy is, he is a water man, and he had just watched a rescue that he knew, professionally in his bones, he could not have made, performed by the woman he'd mocked, and there is no room left for a big laugh after a thing like that. He took off his cap. That was all. He took off his cap and he held it and he looked at the float and he did not say one word. And from Roy Tancredi that silence was the loudest apology that man has ever made. But it is not the salute I hold on to. It is what happened after at the edge of it all that I actually keep. Junie Bishop came running down the ramp. She'd been up at the pavilion the whole time with one of the other mothers, kept back from the water the way you keep children back. And she'd seen it all from up there. Seen her mother go off the float, seen the 11 minutes, seen the salute. And now she came pelting down the ramp in her Founder's Day dress, all elbows and enthusiasm. And she hit her mother at a dead run, and Cass caught her the way you catch something precious, one arm going around the girl and the other bracing them both, still dripping, still steaming, and she went down on one knee on the wet float and held her daughter's face in her two hands. And Junie, 8 years old, gap-toothed, said the only thing an 8-year-old could possibly say, which was, "I told them, Mom. I told them and they laughed and I told them you were." And I was close enough this time to hear what Cass Bishop said back. She did not say, "I know, baby." She did not say they were wrong. She looked her daughter in the eye and she said, quietly, in a voice with no triumph in it at all, "It doesn't matter if they believe you, Junie. You know who your mom is. That's the part that was always true. The rest is just noise on the water." And she stood up with the girl on her hip, and she carried her up the ramp through a crowd that parted for her like the sea. And she did not look at Roy Tancredi, and she did not look at me, and she did not need anything from a single one of us. And that, more than the dive, more than the 5 trips under the hull, more than the salute, that is the thing that finally taught me what I had been too proud and too blind to see all afternoon, that her strength had never once depended on our believing in it. We had laughed, and it had cost her nothing, because a woman who has held 19 men out of the Kamchatka cold does not need a pavilion's permission to be who she is. The laughter had only ever been our loss. It had only ever measured how little we could see. That was 4 years ago. Cass still works the lunch counter at the elementary school because it turns out she likes it, likes the kids, likes a quiet life on a coast that reminds her of nowhere she'll talk about. The town tried to make a fuss of her, a plaque, a ceremony, a spot at the front of the next Founder's Day parade, and she declined all of it so firmly and so kindly that we stopped asking. She serves the tater tots. She carries the propane tanks 2 at a time. If you didn't know, you still wouldn't know, and I think she prefers it that way. Roy Tancredi retired his charters the following spring. He'll tell you it was his knees. But he also quietly funded the swimming lessons that every 3rd grader in Harlow Bay now takes, free, in the town pool, taught to read a tide and respect the cold, and he does not attach his name to it, and I have never once heard him laugh at anybody's mother again. I still run Founder's Day. I'm getting too old for it, and one of these years I'll hand it off. But I changed one thing, and I changed it that first year after, and I'll keep it changed as long as the job is mine. When the children stand up to say what their families do, I don't move it along brisk and kind anymore when one of them says something big. I let it sit. I let the whole pavilion sit with it. Because I stood on that landing and watched a Navy commander salute a lunch lady in a soaked apron, and I learned, at 61 years old, a thing I should have known at 19, that you do not know who is standing in front of you. You never do. The quiet ones in the long sleeves have carried men out of water that would stop your heart, And they will do it again without telling you. And they will go back to serving your children's lunch. And the only thing your contempt ever measures is the size of the thing you were too small to see. Junie Bishop is 12 now. She's on the swim team. She's fast, of course she's fast, and last spring at a meet I heard a kid from another town ask her, snide the way kids are, what her mom did trying to get a rise. Junie didn't rise, she's her mother's daughter. She just looked at the kid, level and calm, water still running off her from the race she'd won, and she said, "She makes lunch at my school." And she left it there, and she walked away. And I stood at the edge of that pool, an old man with my eyes stinging, because I understood, finally and completely, that the child had learned the whole of it, that the truth doesn't need your mouth to defend it, that you carry it quiet, that you let the water do the talking when the water asks, and not 1 second before. That's the story. That's all of it, exactly as I saw it from the man who laughed. I've told it once now, the way you're supposed to tell the ones that change you, plainly and against yourself and true. They laughed when that little girl said her mom was a Navy SEAL. Then the tide turned, and we all found out what the quiet woman in the long sleeves had been the whole time. And not one of us ever laughed again.